Today is the last session of the Stephen Crane lecture cycle, but it's probably not going to be the last lecture cycle. We are planning on one for the coming winter again. So if you're still students then, or wherever you are, we hope we'll be able to do it in the same format. That is, even if you've moved on to the Antarctic or whatever, wherever, you can still watch it on the Carl-Schurz-Haus YouTube channel. Stephen Crane's times were a time of acceleration. And as I said at the start of this lecture series, a period brimming with inventions and innovation. Now, what were those innovations? Just a recap. Again, as I said, American culture is dominated and really organized along the lines of technologization, convergence, and transformation all the way from the 18th century, when American culture proper starts, after the British North American culture before. The late 19th century is overshadowed, one should say, by the effects of industrialization, including bloody and protracted labor wars. There is a huge wave of immigration in the 1980s that Crane would have been witness to. There are attempts at colonizations and even some sort of thinly camouflaged imperialism that the US government indulges in for a while, starting with attempts to take over Santo Domingo in 1972, and then in the 1890s, Crane's actually part of an effort in Cuba that's supposedly going to get the Spanish Empire out of there, but at the same time it establishes US superiority on the island. And this is one of the more dangerous developments, and one that's continuing to this day and taking on speed actually as we are speaking, the subsumption of the original American Republican democracy as designed by the founding fathers under economic liberalism in the second half of the 19th century. And that's a movement that's taking new formats and becoming increasingly ugly today. Also accelerating is the destruction of ecosystems, pollution of water resources, already visible and being commented on by Crane's contemporaries, but not by him. There are wildfires like the Peshtigo fire in 1871, the year Crane was born, which happens exactly on the same date as the Chicago fire, but is far more destructive. Actually, it killed more people in the US than any other fire since, more than 1700. And for the extinction of whole species stands here the passenger pigeon, of which there were 5 billion in the early 19th century, and the last one died in 1914. So they managed to hunt these birds to complete extinction. Another figure that might be of interest, I heard that just the other day, the conversion of biomass into dead matter, signified here by the cement block, had taken on 3% of the whole land, of the whole biomass of the earth in 1900. By 2020, we've reached the tipping point with more than 50% of everything being dead matter. So we're turning this into a dead planet. But that's something that we can't blame Crane for. He wouldn't have known any of that, but he didn't seem to be particularly interested in ecological questions either. Time, I said acceleration of time. The continental division into 4 standard time zones in North America is something that happens within his days. on November 18th, 1883, that was officially designed. The necessity for it being obvious if you think of telegraph systems and also rail travel. I mean, you need a reliable timetable to get anywhere. It becomes necessary after the junction of two railroad lines meeting each other in Promontory, Utah in 1869. So before Crane was born. But you get an idea of the acceleration of rail travel also looking at this map here. Railroads built by 1870. There's that one line going from Omaha to San Francisco. And 1890, if there's anything that is surprising about it, it's the congregation of railroad lines in the Chicago and Midwestern region rather than just along the Eastern coast. And you can see that the postbellum South is still, by comparison, not that crisscrossed by rail tracks and railroad lines. Where does rail travel come into Crane's work? For instance, here, this is the original edition of one of his most famous stories, The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky. But even in the illustration here, it's the figures that are prominent, whereas the train is moving off into the distance. And this is almost exactly how Crane treats the train in the story. We get an insight into the Pullman car and you get an idea of the two characters. There's a film version from the 1950s where she looks decidedly more pretty and he looks decidedly more stalwart. But Crane wasn't particularly lucky with the film versions being made of his works. Anyway, that's not something that needs to concern us overly. We move on because Crane is writing, and he wrote this sort of satirical Western story, The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, at a time when there's a lot of popular reading material about people like Buffalo Bill, invented by a writer by the name of, well, actually the pen name of Ned Buntline. So Crane could have written more popular stuff and more adventurous stuff, but he didn't. Another time that he used a train ever is at the very beginning of The Third Violet, and The Third Violet is the one book, the closest Crane ever came to writing popular fiction, but that was a rather silly romance. And it starts with the engine bellowed its way up the slanting, winding valley. Grey crags and trees with roots fastened cleverly to the steeps looked down at the struggles of the black monster. Black monster. So no particular enthusiasm for trains or train travel. Even the train finally releases its passengers with the enthusiasm of escaping convicts. No, was Crane an author who celebrated technology? Actually not. And there were a whole host of game changer inventions in his time and in his days. And look at all the things that he did not write about. There's chronophotography and film. Chronophotography is when you take photos in short succession, not yet a film actually, but then establishing a sequence of photographs. There are phonographs, and it just occurs to me that I had planned on bringing today my friend Andreas Schmauder, who actually has a phonograph, but somehow that has fallen by the wayside. High-rise architecture, the whole electricity thing and X-ray medicine that came with it. I'll go into some detail with these things in just a second. Here's him again. And what did I want this for? There are no films showing Crane. Well, film is one of the things that I just mentioned. Not a single camera ever turned on him during his lifetime, which is not something that might have gone completely unexpected. As I think I mentioned before, the first president who used film and also voice recording in a presidential campaign was William McKinley in 1896. And you can see a still from that movie, which is on the movie database of the Library of Congress. McKinley accepting the or receiving the telegram with his nomination as presidential candidate in his home in Dalton, Ohio. Of course, that's not a natural recording, even though it was supposed to look like one. Where would Crane have come into contact with film? Here, as a correspondent in the Spanish-American War. In the middle of the picture, the guy with the glasses and the mustache, that's the vice president of the United States under McKinley. That is Theodore Roosevelt, who after McKinley's assassination ascended to the presidency in 1901. And there were film reels being taken in Cuba as Crane and while Crane was there. For example, this one. This is a real film being shot on site, showing lightly injured, lightly wounded soldiers, US soldiers getting into boats and going to the hospital ship Olivet. At one point in Crane's stories, he mentions the Olivet, so he may have even seen the scene here. He was at Las Guajimas at one point. I'm not sure if it was exactly this, but as I said, no mention of it. There were also, by the way, a lot of fake news already in the Spanish-American War, like this scene supposedly showing Roosevelt's cavalry. The horse is not supposed to be dead, but they were supposed to lie down so as to provide a smaller target if they were in a fighting situation. And but this was actually filmed in New Jersey by Edison Company, and it's a complete fake. Crane was in Cuba himself, but he does not write about the colonial situation. He does not write about the films being taken, for instance, being recorded, but just about that war, the fighting, and it also inspired a number of his later stories, including the so-called Spitsbergen tales. Crane, as I said, is not a naturalist in the sense that he would write a lot about natural sights and vistas. He's decidedly a city dweller, and what you get here is a little box that was sold some years back with a signed copy of Maggie. That's not the first edition, it's the second one, but it came with this photograph here of Crane and his buddies. Crane is identified as the one in the back in the middle. I doubt that. I think he's actually the one front left, but if he's in the picture, he clearly indulged this kind of morbid joke. He's supposed to not really have loved being taken pictures of either, and he does not mention photography a lot in his books, even though in Maggie it would have been possible. Like we could speculate whether he knew Jacob Ries's book. I mentioned this before, how the other half lives, with the illustrations in 1890. How the photograph edition, however, would post-date Crane's Maggie. That came out only in 1895. Also, he writes a lot about social conditions, but not about social movements. And if you want to know a bit more about social movements in New York in the 1880s, 1890s, so around this time, I recommend this book, which not only has a hilarious title, but also tells you something about the German immigration, which you're probably not familiar with. So the next slide's going to be interesting because here I have an actual movie in there. One technological item that Crane does write about on a variety of occasions are fire engines. In Maggie, he describes Jimmy as a teamster. And the only thing that inspires awe into Jimmy is a fire engine. Here we have New York traffic as it would have looked around the time. Crane even exaggerates this a little bit, says they're lined up for blocks and traffic jams. And here's the passage from the text itself. Does anybody else want to read this text so that I don't do everything? Are you actually still there? I see an empty space where Isa Günsting was.
I can read if you want.
Since you're there.
It is possible, perhaps, that this young man would have derided in an axle-wide alley the approach of a flying ferry boat. Yet he achieved a respect for a fire engine. As one charged towards his truck, he would drive fearfully upon a sidewalk, threatening untold people with annihilation. When an engine would strike a mass of block trucks, splitting it into fragments as a blow annihilates a cake of ice, Jimmy's team could usually be observed high and safe, with whole wheels on the sidewalk. The fearful coming of engine could break up the most intricate model of heavy vehicles, at which the police had been swearing for the half of an hour.
Let's see whether this actually works. Yeah. Oh, wow. It does. Okay, here comes a fire engine. And I mean this and a crew wagon, and I think the next one's actually a ladder. Yep, the long one with a ladder on it, and people getting into the street, but moving quickly out of the way as another smoke belching steam pumper with 3 hoses in front of it rattles past. Okay, so you get an idea of what that looked like. It's probably a show event. People knew about it and would congregate here. Here's another one, 3 of them. The whole fire department are all out, everything in succession, so that people really get something to look at. Yeah, that's what they would have looked like with more time to look at the details, and somewhat older one than the ones you saw in the picture. The Muscat company is now located in Massachusetts. So, what Crane would have also seen happening is the building of the New York skyscrapers, like these buildings here. But even that, if I'm not mistaken, he does not really comment on extensively. Now, 2 of them, the New York Times building and the New York Tribune building, are even buildings that were set up by the newspaper magnates of the time, newspapers that he wrote for. So he would have entered those buildings in order to receive paychecks or deliver texts that he had written, but it doesn't seem to have impressed him particularly. Most of Crane's stories, and particularly the most popular ones, are in fact set in small town America. That would include the early Sullivan County sketches and also the later, in fact, collected only after and published only after his death. He prepared them for publication, but did not see them come out. The so-called Willemville stories. Willem being a medieval English term for erstwhile, back then, in those days. And this is the house that Crane grew up in Port Asbury Park, not Port Asbury, Asbury Park, New Jersey, which now houses the Stephen Crane Museum. Gerd Horn, my old friend Gerd Horn, already wrote about this in his doctoral thesis in 1991, which is called Fragmented Urban Images. And he explains that most of the American writers of the 1990s and early 1900s who write about big cities as molochs and spreading, incomprehensible, populated by whirling masses of people, and who also write about train engines as monsters and so on, actually came from small town America and never really grew into the kind of city dwellers that they're supposed to be, or were supposed to be, according to earlier modernist theorizing and secondary material that you find about them. Crane is part of the movement that would write investigative journalism. So he wrote for both of these people at some point. But again, it's interesting to see that he never really developed a taste for writing, for instance, about science. If you look at Edgar Allan Poe, by comparison, who also died fairly young, he wrote more than 1,000 newspaper articles and essays, and he wrote far more essays and stories about science and scientific inventions than he wrote his famous short stories. So here's two writers writing about different things. For instance, Louis Pasteur, who invented the rabies and the anthrax vaccine, Robert Koch, science responsible for the discovery of the cholera, of what caused cholera and tuberculosis. There is a spirit in the 1890s of what another student of mine, Anja Mewart, is currently writing on her master thesis, has called scientific triumphalism. And this scientific triumphalism could not even be curbed by the fact that tuberculin, which Robert Koch came up with as a cure for tuberculosis, did not work at all. Something that did work and happened within Crane's days, but which he did not take up as a subject, would be this gentleman. Anybody recognize him?
Mr. Röntgen.
Yeah, Konrad Röntgen. Okay, that's a bit giveaway here with the X-rays being mentioned. But yeah, that's him. Or 1896, Guillermo Marconi. 1897, the first transmission of radio waves across the Bristol Channel. That's not too far away from Suffolk, where Crane then moves in well, he was in Britain before, so he would have read about it in the newspapers by all means, but again, doesn't really mention it. Why did I topicalize this? Actually, that was triggered by John Adams when he talked about Jack London's camera. London, a contemporary here in 1904 during the Russo-Japanese conflict, carries a camera around with himself and takes pictures, not necessarily really good ones, but I have a Kodak camera that's about half the size of this one from the 1920s. And unfortunately, since this is not a live show, you can't see it. And yeah, here's the phonograph that I mentioned earlier, which Crane also never used other than contemporaries, like, for instance, Mark Twain. We have a movie with Mark Twain walking around his house in Connecticut, and we also have a recording of Crane on one of those early wax cylinders, but Crane did not want to do this. In effect, the only thing that is actually modernist about Crane really is his use of textual technologies. Other than that, what we find in him is a skepticism of industrialization, a skepticism of showmanship for sure, and a skepticism of stereotyping. And with that, he in a way again anticipates Ernest Hemingway. I mentioned him before. That's another clip I copied from my initial contribution to this series here. Henry James, Stephen Crane, Mark Twain. Henry James is also one of those reluctant modernists who will rather write about class situations and the psychology of his mostly upper middle class and upper class characters, but he rather not go into too much detail about current technologies at all. So what is modern then about all of this? The American dream in the modern period, to just rehash again, is one in individual salvation. And we have seen, and we will see again today, that Crane is rather reluctant to subscribe to that. The belief in progress on all levels is something that he does not subscribe to. And as far as nationalist ideology, as opposed to internationalist approaches, oh, there's an O missing, sorry, goes, he does not really become very expressive. In fact, the only time he writes a political satire, a short political satire, it's misunderstood, and it does cost a representative for the state of New Jersey his job, and Crane gets into pretty hot water for this, and then gets into a lot of trouble because he's written that thing. So maybe because of that, he does not really write about political ideologies of any kind after that, but will rather focus on his modernist narrative textual technologies. And to sum them up again, personal narration is one of his strong points, usually a limited third-person viewpoint, mostly singular, but on a few occasions, as I pointed out in connection with the open boat, he actually writes in third-person plural. Also with this borderline to omniscience, but he plays around with the idea of anything or anybody being able to know and see everything, same as he occasionally gets into a camera eye technique, which really surprises me because at the same time, as I said, he does not he seems to not have even owned a camera at any point in his life. Let's see if we can jump. Yeah, I mentioned this one already in connection with Stephen Crane and drama. The naturalism that turns ridiculous and in fact turns in on the character that tries to get out of his real manacles and can't, and in effect gets killed. Scepticism of Stereotyping, one of the last texts Crane published during his lifetime, is this book, and it includes one of the strangest texts in his oeuvre, well, the one called The Monster. In The Monster, the main character gets horrifyingly burned during a house fire, and first half of the text is the development of him into this terrifying sight that people are afraid of. And here Crane might have reacted to an Englishman who was advertised as the Elephant Man. There's also a movie about him. So people paid money to see him and to be sort of shocked at his disfiguration. He was suffering from a disease that makes bones grow completely wild and irregularly. If this fire and this disfiguration of the main character, who is an African-American by the name of Henry Johnson, had happened 50 years earlier, he might have ended up on in P.T. Barnum's American Museum as an exhibition piece. But those days are over, but not the days when a whole village, Willemville, will turn into a monster. The village becomes monstrous, ostracizing the Trescott family that's still taking care of Henry Johnson because he got injured that badly trying to save the boy of the family, who's the native viewpoint character. James Nagel in 1999 called The Monster in many ways the most complex work on the Crane canon. At once a children's tale, that's mostly the viewpoint, a grim social satire, that's definitely true, an ambitious study of ethical responsibility, I'm not sure what is ambitious about it, and a painful examination of race in America, a devastating account of the village virus. What he calls the village virus here is how this monstrosity, this ostracization of the Trescott family, this rejection of somebody who's initially called a hero, but then everybody expects him to die. Heroes that are incredibly, horrifyingly disfigured and also apparently gone crazy over the pain and the whole situation are supposed to be dead. And this guy isn't. It anticipates the hospitals after the First World War, where soldiers who were so badly wounded that their families didn't want to see them again were hosted. There were at least rumors of hospitals like that being located in rural Britain and France. And there's a book by what's his name, Hugo Friedrich, no, it wasn't Hugo, but Friedrich, about the First World War, and he has photographs in that of these soldiers. The story is also clearly based on Henry Ibsen's play An Enemy of the People, where a doctor insisting on his finding and what he thinks is right is ostracized by the people. Political satire was not really Crane's forte always. As I said, he tried to write at least one piece of more or less silly romance. You can call that a political satire, but it wasn't received well. Here's another comment by a contemporary: a hopelessly scentless third violet, and what the audience wanted from Crane was war, war, war. So what do you do if you don't want to write war novels any longer? What were the possible escape routes that Crane had at his disposal at the time? Just a sec, I need to check my notes here for something. Yeah, so he wrote about war, as you all know. He also wrote about, for instance, time, the time that he lived in. Modernism. The modernism that Crane really becomes the harbinger and the forerunner of. Industrial and technological modernization, this is not what, as I pointed out so far, what he topicalizes, but the cultural consciousness of being in a transition phase. This is something that we get here, and also with non-modernist writers like Henry James, for instance. This is what we get with William Dean Howells, with Hamlin Garland, with a lot of these contemporaries. So there is a strange irony in the fact that Crane is at the same time a formal modernist and topically, so in the form we see this cultural practice of the new in an attempt at a radical breakaway from received forms, certainly, whereas topically we don't. Or thematically we don't, and I find this one of the things that I have to grapple with for a while. Maybe it may have to do with his rejection of what I mentioned here, this whole Republican democracy being subsumed under economic liberalism, because if Crane was, if there's one thing that Crane was not, he was not a capitalist. So he's not an economic liberal. He's quite the opposite. Capitalism, as Walter Benjamin was to call it 30 years later, is in fact a religious practice. And if you look at Crane's life, there's none of that self-made man saving money, investing his money, and so on, that you get with even other writers of the time. Mark Twain, for instance, was constantly involved in some sort of industrial wagers. He lost his whole fortune at one point when he invested it into the development of a typewriter, and this typewriter, the Page typewriter, did not make it. It was a dead end. It didn't work properly anyway. So that's one of the reasons why Twain had to write like a bloody beaver in order to pay his bills. With Crane, there is something strongly bohemian about him. Bohemian in the sense that you get group of people. They're more prominent in France and in Germany in this period. People like Arno Holz, Johannes Schlaf, Friedrich Paul Greve, wastrels, misfits, they're called sometimes. I mean, Crane gets £50 from Joseph Conrad, who was far more conscious of where his money came from and what he wanted to do with it. Gets £50 from them and to pay his bills in England, and the next thing you know is he wastes all that on a champagne breakfast with his buddies. What do you do with a guy like that? But at the same time, there is something about this bohemianism that's vaguely reminiscent of Occupy Wall Street. Know what I mean? Of a conscious counter-reaction to this absolute primate of capital, of money, of this subsumption of everything and everybody under the auspices of being a good citizen and making as much money as you can. Within that field, or inside that practice of non-capitalism, that's where Cora Crane also belongs, even though she was far more like that. She was the one who tried to hold the money together. She was the one who was constantly writing to people asking for money to pay the bills, while Stephen was throwing it out of the window. And we shouldn't be surprised probably that Cora Crane, after his death, moved back to Florida, took over the brothel again that she was the madam of when he met her, and lived there to 1910, when she died of a heart attack trying to push a car out of the sand at the beach. So there's that sad ending. If Crane aligned himself with a movement of the time, or at least it looked like it, rather than the Bohemians, it would be the strenuous life ideology that people like Oliver Wendell Holmes and Theodore Roosevelt again expounded. Now, Oliver Wendell Holmes had been an officer in the American Civil War, and even though he came out of that war completely rattled and rather traumatized, by the 1890s he had developed a glorifying memory of this war participation, of the kind that Crane satirizes in his figure of Henry Fleming in The Red Badge of Courage, you know, and where Henry Fleming at the end of that book is already glorifying himself, looking back at the battle that he's just experienced. Holmes, in around the same time that Crane writes the book, gives this laudatory oration in, I think it's a commencement address in Harvard, where he studied, where he talks about, in our youth, our hearts were touched by fire. Fire's coming up as a topic time and again here. Theodore Roosevelt, similarly, a sickly child, actually much like Crane. He's the police commissioner in New York when Crane runs afoul of him in a somewhat stupid case, really. It's about involves a prostitute, and he makes an enemy out of Theodore Roosevelt. And in fact, after that, he's harassed by police until he leaves the city. So, but the same idea, same ideology. Go west, young man, and prove yourself. And there's something vaguely ridiculous about this guy here with the Western outfit. Note the fringes, yeah. And the gun and the backdrop's actually painted. Yeah, so we don't have to talk about this in all that much detail. But this idea of the strenuous life, this looking for adventure, in another highway. Well, there were no highways really. It almost got Crane creamed, at least at this time, this point. This is a picture taken, misidentified in Auster's book. This one here was taken a couple of days after he'd been picked up at the beach after the experience of the open boat, where Crane had to realize, or realized for himself at least, that whatever this strenuous life ideology had in common with him ended where nature that was glorified by these people is absolutely oblivious to the individual, doesn't care a hoot whether we live or die. If we make a mistake, depending on the environment that we're in, it counts double. It may count double because it may be very well be your first and your last mistake that you make. So this whole Henry David Thoreau, Walden Pond, blah, 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 is, as far as I'm concerned, romantic bullshit. And to quote Bertolt Brecht, und es kommt nichts nachher. But Crane, this is the face of a man who has looked into nothingness, into the big nothing that comes afterwards. And one of my favorite sentences in American literature, Isa, you want to read this again, or do I do it?
Yours is probably better if you read it.
When it occurs to a man that nature does not regard him as important, and that she feels she would not maim the universe by disposing of him, he at first wishes to throw bricks at the temple, and he hates deeply the fact that there are no bricks on the temple. Yeah, I could stop there already, but it continues with just one more slide. Scientific Triumphalism III. When this medicinal scientific triumphalism finally caught up with Stephen Crane, he was beyond the point where he could have done anything about it. And they practically packed him up and shipped him to Badenweiler in 1900, regardless of whether he liked the Germans or not. He didn't. And so here was the chance for this scientific triumphalism and for tuberculin to work. It didn't. And but even Albert Frankl, who at that time back then was mentioned or in one breath with Pasteur and Koch, couldn't do anything about Crane. The main and the most highly endowed prize award, scientific award in pneumology is still named after Frankl in Germany, but Crane he could not save. So Badenweiler, 5th of June 1900, that strenuous life ended, and with that ends our lecture series. Thank you all for listening and watching.